I myself am not Catholic, but very similar belief system, and I'm kind of shocked at how little response there has been from the church. I even phoned one of the local churches the other day, and the pastor just told me he didn't want to speak to me. If I was a member of the Catholic Church, I'd be completely embarrassed by the actions of the school now that they're claiming they're Catholic. It's kind of disappointing to see the lack of response from the local Catholic Church.
All right, the young man that we just saw there was Josh Alexander. This young man was suspended and arrested for upholding his Christian beliefs and ignoring the ban that they tried to place on him when he upheld and expressed his Christian beliefs. This is a crazy story, but it just shows you how far we've gone in terms of religious persecution in the nation of Canada and the hampering of the gospel, particularly to the LGBTQ community. I'm going to read you some parts of the article here. I'm going to post the article here, but I'm going to read you some parts of the article so that you can just hear what is happening in the very province of Ontario where I reside currently. Let's take this in here. This is a pretty crazy story. Go ahead, like, subscribe, comment on the video. It goes a long way. So Catholic schools, this is a national poll. A Catholic school has student arrested for expressing Catholic beliefs. The student said, I said there were only two genders and you were born either a male or a female, and that got me into trouble. The fact that Canada is becoming less tolerant comes as no surprise. But even so, a Catholic high school getting one of their 16-year-old students arrested is a bit of a shock, especially when the heart of the issue is his actual religious beliefs. Josh Alexander was arrested by police Monday afternoon for breaching an exclusion order. But the real crime that the student is being punished for is upholding his Catholic beliefs and doing so in what some would no doubt think is a defiant and troublesome manner. Josh is a Christian. He identifies as a born-again Christian. Josh is a Christian, and he believes there are only two genders. This is Orthodox Christianity. The mass majority of Christians who uphold Orthodox beliefs believe that there are only two genders. So he believes that. He believes that people cannot switch genders and that male students should use girls' washrooms. He's very big on these things, right? I got suspended for comments made during a class discussion. So this is happening in a classroom discussion where you think learning is about discussing your beliefs, sharing even some of your opinions, and maybe coming to a consensus, maybe agreeing to disagree, but you've learned the other side, the other perspective. You think that's what would be what education is about. Apparently, if you're not online with the narrative, then you are condemned for thinking wrongly. That's apparently what this is. So it was about male students using female washrooms. This is the discussion happening within the classroom. Gender dysphoria and what is called male breastfeeding. Everyone was sharing their opinions on it. Any student who wanted to was participating, including the teacher. I said there were only two genders and you were born either a male or a female, and that got me into trouble. And then I said that gender does not trump biology. Whew. This kid's daring, man. He just said it right then and there. And I guess his convictions were far too strong for them to allow that type of conversation to slide. They then went on to say that he was bullying. I guess there may have been transgendered students in the classroom, and that he went on to be suspended, right? That's what happened. Here's what his lawyer has to say. James Kitchen, a lawyer from the Liberty Defense Fund, which is representing Josh, said in a statement that the student was told he could only return to school if he agreed not to use the dead name of any transgendered student and agreed to exclude himself from his two afternoon classes because those classes are attended by two transgendered students who disapprove of Josh's religious beliefs. Josh said that he never dead named anyone. That is referred to their previous name before transitioning. So dead naming is when you look at somebody's previous name, maybe their given name, their birth name. You can't call them that anymore once they transition and they give themselves a new name. Compelling Josh to utter falsehoods regarding gender contrary to his beliefs and segregating him from classes are repugnant manifestations of religious discrimination, said James Kitchen. So there we go. So that shows you right there. They don't mind segregating the Christian. They don't mind discriminating against the Christian. I showed you in a previous video the wheel of privilege, the idea of intersectionality, and how the Christian is close to power, how the cisgendered male is close to power, how the white male is close to power. And if you fall into these categories, which this young man happens to fall into these categories, it's okay to discriminate against you. That's where our culture has gone. It's totally a-okay to discriminate against you. So there are some individuals who have more rights than others. We don't all have equal rights. Equal rights is gone. It's a thing of the past. We don't all have equal rights anymore. It depends on where you fall in the wheel of privilege. That's what's really going on right now. So he was suspended, and then what does it say here? He left the class almost immediately. So it says here on Monday, when he tried to go to school, the cops were called and he got arrested. So he didn't believe that he was suspended on rightful grounds. He thinks that that this is religious intolerance, and he says, you know what? I'm not even bound to need to this. I'm showing up back at school. I'm trying to get my education. I'm 16 years old. I'm trying to learn something. And they said he walked into one of the classes, sat down, and everyone looked pretty surprised. This is what he's saying. I walked into one of my classes. I sat down. Everyone looked pretty surprised to see me there. Within 2 minutes, the vice principal was in the classroom asking me to leave. He left the class, and almost immediately I was met with the police. Josh was put in the back of a cruiser. Think about this. Man, he was put in the back of a cruiser, driven off the property, and later released and charged with trespassing. Think about that. This young man was arrested. There was no other way to deal with this situation. This young man was arrested, put in the back of a cruiser, driven off the school property, and then charged with trespassing. Like, these cops, I guess, had nothing better to do. They had no real criminals to go after. So let's get the activist, young Christian kid who just wants to express his religion in a co-religious institution, which is crazy. So that's what happened. That's what happened. Now they don't want to hear his case. They're trying to avoid hearing his case, which is crazy. But I pray that it all goes through and that the trustees of this particular school board are forced to have to hear his case, because they need to defend their actions. Essentially, they need to defend the suspension. They need to defend their decision making of their administration. And I pray that everything goes according to the current lineup of the Ontario Human Rights Code. I mean, this kid has the right to express himself freely, especially in a classroom setting. Man, people can disagree with it, but he should be able to express himself. Man, if I was a high school student or a university student today, I would have been arrested a long time ago. I remember I was in a black women's writing class. I took this feminist course, black women's writing class. I did English literature in university, so, but yeah, I was in a black women's writing class, and we were learning about all these things, and we started talking about the male hegemonic gaze, right? And basically, I said this so nonchalantly, I guess it offended some people, but I said, modesty is very important, and I positioned it as, a woman should consider the way that she presents herself to society. These are the things my mother taught me. When I'm looking for a woman, when I'm pursuing a woman, I should consider how she carries herself, how she carries her dress is a part of how she carries herself. Is she carrying herself modestly? Is she considering how she is going to be perceived by others when she goes out? You know what I mean? My mama taught me these things. And when I said that, there was such a visceral reaction within the class that 2 girls got up and left the room crying. And people were just like, the only other guy in the class, it was just me and this other black guy in the class. The only other guy in the class literally put his hand in his face like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this guy just said this. I got rebuked by the professor. She was appalled that I had the audacity to say such a thing. I got rebuked by the professor, but at the end of the class, here was the crazy thing. At the end of the class, so many students were coming up to me, asking me questions about my ideas. Just like how students were coming up to the professor, asking her to expound on certain things. And I had an opportunity to actually preach the gospel, to speak about what the Bible has to say about modesty and why I believe what I believe. It opened the door for me to preach the gospel. And so this is what is happening in our society today. We can no longer speak to these things, and it's closing doors. That's what the society wants, to close the door for us to speak the gospel specifically to this community and also to the culture at large. This is a problem. This is why what this young man is going through today matters, and we need to support him. Man, I'm going to throw the link in there to his fundraiser or whatever, his GoFundMe account or whatever it is, to help fund the lawyers and the fight and the battle. It's so important because the doctrine of sin is under attack. There's an all-out onslaught on the doctrine of sin within our culture. We can no longer call sin, sin. A part of what they tried to do to this young man, they told him he can only post scriptures. Take this in. He can post scriptures online, like the verses, verbatim, but he can't expound on those scriptures. Think about that. Think about that for a second. They're basically saying, what is expounding on scriptures? It's preaching. It's teaching. They're basically telling this young man, you can't preach and teach what you believe. His freedom of expression is gone. And so many people in Canada are afraid and are scared and are not saying anything. Even pastors. I remember I had a conversation with a pastor, a leader whom I respect to this day, a very gracious man. He told me, I'm not called to the LGBT. I spoke against certain movements that were going on within the culture and the roots being within this community. And he said, we can't do that. We can't speak on those things. We can't speak on those issues. And I said, why not? We have to warn the young people. We have to tell them they're being deceived by these things. He said, oh no, we can't speak against that community. So he's already been shaken by the spirit of intimidation, by the spirit of fear. So many leaders and pastors won't speak to these things. And now the doctrine of sin is under assault because we won't call out the sins. We won't stand up. It's time to stand up. It's time to stand up. It's well past the time to stand up. But we have to stand up and we have to speak to the sin. What is sin? So the definition of sin given above specifies that sin is a failure. Listen to it. It's a failure to conform to God's moral law, not only in action and in attitude, but also in our moral nature. Our very nature, the internal character, that is the essence of who we are as persons, can also be sinful. So what is sin? It's a failure, any failure, to conform to God's moral law in action, in attitude, and also in nature. It's important for us to understand what sin is, because sin, it can also be within our nature. It feels natural to sin. Our attitudes and our actions can conclude to sin. So what does that mean? That means it doesn't matter if you're born into it. You know, there's a big argument. Were they born that way or were they not born that way? If they were born that way, then we should accept them that way. No, we are all born into sin. We are all born as sinners. You know, I spoke about it in my previous video. King David prayed, said, I was conceived in my mother's womb in sin. So does that mean that because we're born as sinners, there's no hope for us? We must just wallow in our sin. There's no hope for us because we're born as sinners? No, God forbid. The blood of Jesus Christ, his sacrifice on the cross, has made a way for us, that our sin nature can be removed and it can be replaced with the divine, the God nature. That's the gospel message. That's what Jesus came to give us. Salvation from sin. So if we can't call out sins, if we can't speak plainly and clearly to what is a sin, how can we preach the gospel? Pastor, hear me today. How can we preach the gospel? This is not conversion therapy. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, this is what sin is. You know, today in our culture, if we feel a certain way and we identify with what we feel, then that feeling trumps everything. That's what our culture has taught us. So because this particular community identifies as such and it's a part of their personhood, yes, the sinful nature could be a part of our person. That doesn't mean that we must accept it as so. We can reject that nature. We can reject that identity. I reject my previous identity as a fornicator. I reject my previous identity as a thief, as a liar, as a deceiver. I reject my previous identity and I put on Christ. I take on a new nature. I take on a new identity. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is the hope that we have as believers, that when we see him, we will be made like him. This is what we hope for. This is what we long for. This is what we preach, that we can all have this hope, that we can all strive for this, regardless of whatever the sin issue is. It may not be a crime. It's not illegal in our society to practice these sins, but yea, they are still sins. The moral law, the divine law is higher than the societal law, than the law of the Leviticus 18 verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It's telling men they should not lie with other men as they do with women. Why? It's an abomination. God is separating his people. When you read Leviticus, it tells you God is separating his people from the Egyptians, saying you're not going to be like the place you're coming from. And the Canaanites, the place you're going, you're not going to be like them either. I am your Lord. I am your God. You're going to be like me. And in order to be like me, here's a set of rules and regulations. This is how you're going to conduct yourself. And one of those things is an abomination for a man to lie with a man. Don't do it. It's unnatural for a woman to lie with a woman. Don't do it. Here's another one. Deuteronomy 22 verse 5. A woman shall not wear a man's garment, and nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak. For whoever does these things, again, it's an abomination to the Lord your God. So Jesus came to save us from these things. That's what the scripture is saying. Jesus came to save us from these things. We don't have to take on these things. Maybe today I might feel like feminine. I might feel like a woman. That doesn't mean I have to put on a dress to identify with it. We don't have to take those things on, is what the scripture is saying. So it's important for us to understand sin is sin. Jesus came to save us from sin. Even if it isn't criminal, within our cultural context, it's still a sin against God's divine law. And so let's lean into the gospel. Let's stand up for the gospel. Let's support this young man in his fight, because it really matters. That's all I got for this video today. God bless you guys, and see you in the next one.